We're also in a moment of a counter revolution, of, entrenching that all of these gains that have been made over the 11 months in order to expose, in order to show, in order to debunk, in order to mobilize, in order to, move lawsuits, in order to, I brought, you talk about non-compliance with the US law, national security memorandum, like all of this momentum and energy that has pushed really the US and Israel into a corner and into isolation, right? Rather than that just becoming very evident so that we can push them all the way, over that edge. Instead, it's a counter-revolutionary moment where they're doubling down. They're doubling down, where media is resurrecting tired talking points about 40,000 Palestinians are collateral damage because of Hamas. I mean, really?
Right.
When you have seen that there are no safe zones. You cannot have collateral damage if civilians have nowhere to shelter. And even if you think somehow Hamas just appears in every shelter that Israel intended to maintain, right? There is an obligation on belligerent states, according to the first additional protocol, which regulates precisely this type of asymmetric, warfare, which, if we are to understand it as warfare, which basically mandates that the belligerent states shall desist from an operation where the civilian cost is excessive. At what point do you agree that it has become excessive, right? And so you see media doubling down, like they're resurrecting these talking points that we shamed them from using. I saw us shame them from using it. And then last week, a BBC commentator used it with me. And get this, that interview that I was doing, I thought was going to be about the ceasefire, right? Instead, it was about a humanitarian outbreak. Well, okay, how do you discuss a humanitarian crisis in Gaza right now that doesn't talk about the fact that Israel has destroyed shelters, that Israel has destroyed hospitals, that Israel has contaminated water, that Israel has limited access to life-saving services, right? In response to me wanting to talk about that, I mean, how did polio
Right. Not just a
reemerge?
natural disaster.
No, polio reemerges because water has been contaminated. This correspondent wanted to explain that it's because Palestinians are, dumping their sewage into water sources. Why would they be dumping their sewage? What happened to their bathrooms? What happened to their homes? Who destroyed access to potable water?
Let me just ask you again about the polio there, and whether or not you think there's enough urgency being put not only on the vaccines, but you mentioned the sewage, the sanitation issues in the region. I mean, this seems like something that could have been prevented without vaccines if there were a more suitable way to house the people that have currently been displaced.
All right. Well, precisely because housing has been targeted, Israel has targeted almost 70% of residential housing, causing nearly the displacement of 90% of the Palestinian population of 2 million people. Just last week, they received 5 evacuation orders to go to places where there's no quarter. There's been 16 evacuation orders just in the month of August where people have no place to go. They have been concentrated into an area where there is no infrastructure to sustain civilian life, in a bid either to remove them altogether or to compel Hamas to surrender. The targeting of civilians in order to exact these political concessions is textbook terrorism, and we are allowing it to continue rather than right now, what the U.S. should be doing, which is not just putting tremendous pressure on Israel, but as the provider, the proviso of arms transfers and its impunity within these international multilateral institutions, has the lever to actually stop this right now. They can continue negotiations over the details over what happens, but there is no circumstance where genocide and this military campaign of targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure should be permitted to continue.
In response to me trying to just point out what I thought was quite basic, he comes back and says, he says, It's really unfortunate there isn't an Israeli to respond to you right now. And I just want to point out that Israelis do not think that any of that is true.
And the IDF
Israel
has been telling us
this, and when media doesn't do its job of scrutinizing Israeli claims, we get to 325 days of genocide and new polio outbreaks and skin diseases and children who are amputated without any family or shelter to keep them, because we are merely relying on these talking points rather than investigating on the ground what is happening, rather than challenging the US's undermining of all international law and international systems that should prevent and punish these very.
With all due respect, we've had plenty of people from the IDF, from Israel, on this particular program. I've interviewed several of them, and the BBC continues to report on the situation and asking questions of both sides, of course.
I was shocked in that moment. I've rarely been shocked in an interview. I was shocked in that moment in a way where I couldn't respond as quickly as I wanted. But then I saw on other programs, it looks like BBC policy. They're doing it across the board to anybody who comes on. It's very similar to DW, the German network. They do the same thing, right? They've gotten policy, but we see that we see universities in their counter, revolutionary moment, that rather than now, okay, you're right, there are no universities left. We've had to admit these students because their universities have been destroyed. They might not even have a transcript, right? Instead, they're creating new policy that basically says that being a Zionist is a protected class, and their non-discrimination, protocols
Right,
as
like
at
NYU.
NYU or at other universities like UCLA, where masks and encampments are illegal, or at other universities where basically you have to apply for a free expression permit to basically, they're basically equating protest to theater, right? Say whatever, like free speech is not the ability to just speak. The reason, the utility of free speech is to be able to impact and change an oppressive status quo. That is the purpose of it. It's not so everybody knows my opinion, right? I can tell that's not what matters. That's not why it's threatening.
When you mentioned the BBC protocol, you mean that they are saying they have to have an Israeli on, or they have to
No, no,
put
no, no.
what is the
First of all,
protocol?
first of all, let's be clear. I haven't seen that this is official protocol. I
Okay.
have seen a recent trend whereby BBC correspondents with their Palestinian guests, or with guests that are basically making an argument to stop a genocide, right, are saying, we want to make clear that that Israel would not say this, and that they reject that there is genocide. And when I use the part that they reject, they wouldn't use the word apartheid. It's like, okay, why? What are you doing?
Right.
Who cares
I
what they would say?
Right. Right. Also, I mean, the idea that they would say it's Palestinians like contaminating their own water just gives away how, like, you keep talking about the dehumanization. I mean, they clearly see them slash you as
That's
like
right.
dirty.
Absolutely me. But the cause of our own suffering. I mean,
Right.
that's what it comes down. I was thinking about this, thinking about what's proximate to people that they can maybe understand this, right? Like thinking about the families, like somebody with, the families of incarcerated people, even in the United States, right? When you think about them, your first, unfortunately for most people, their first reaction is not empathy
Right.
for someone whose beloved is incarcerated. The first reaction is, oh, what did they do?
Right.
Right? You want to know. You want to know if they deserved being encaged, right? Forget the fact that maybe they had done nothing, but the system, is rigged, or that there are structural,
Cash
the
bail, whatever.
criminal justice
Yeah.
system, or that the structural conditions that led to this place, or the fact that cops wield a tremendous amount of power and are extension of state violence and can use that power in order, to pursue their own personal ends, right? None of that matters. All that matters is they want to know, what did they do, right? And so I was thinking, in the same way, there is a way in which a mass American public and a European public, I would guess, I'm not in Europe, but I've gone during this time twice, and so spoken there. but that there is an assumption that Palestinians deserve this. We have done something to deserve this. Had we just been more polite, right? Had we been more quiet, had we been less violent, right?
Right, that's
That there
violent,
was
yeah.
something about us, like a congenital
More civilized.
disordered. Had we been civilized, right? That this wouldn't happen. So that there's a block to getting to where you need to understand that the babies that you're watching being slaughtered into pieces, who have to be put into rice bags by kilogram in order to be buried, right? We're never granted the presumption of innocence.
Right.
Um, and that, and we see a US state and society that's acting upon that racist basis, that's
Yeah.
making it really, really, I mean, I'm sorry. The last
No,
thing I
no,
was
keep
just
yeah,
going to
keep
say
going.
about,
I don't wanna cut you off.
that's acting upon this racist basis, but worse, in order to hammer that point home to those who don't believe it anymore, now we see the state mobilizing in order to criminalize further. That this is so bad, right? That this young man who was killed, Hirsch Goldberg
Goldberg
Poland,
Pauline. Yeah.
right? The Israeli hostage
The
that
hostage,
was
yeah.
killed now becomes part of all of our lives and our homes in a way that our prosecutors are going to respond. And obviously, none of this is to negate his, loss of life
Right.
and the pain his family feels, or how, hard that must be. But the way that it's done is not merely because of a concern for his life or a concern for any of these captives' lives. I mean, if we cared, then you would care about now the 21,000 Palestinians who are held captive and hostage, right? It's the weaponization of it, it's the mobilization of it so cynically, that in its mobilization is also emphasizing not only giving a green light for Israel to continue a genocidal campaign in the midst of a presidential election where they want to tell us that somehow there's anything different happening here. But that's going so far as to in narrating that story is emphasizing to an audience that Palestinians aren't human. They were never human. That's why nobody talks about them. They have no human life to return to. There was no dignity, right? It's just it's such a deep, I study this all the time in literature on colonialism and the use of law in order to effectuate this, on critical race theory. And it's one thing to teach this, to read this, to study it theoretically, and then to watch its most horrific, frankly, its most horrific manifestation happen in real time in ways that we can barely keep up with.